wasn't the most auspicious of romantic first encounters. The evening that a man born Truman Streckfus Persons from New Orleans met eyes at a social soiree in the Manhattan home of a mutual acquaintance with the Atlantic City born Jack Dunphy. It was 1948, and Truman Capote, or Capote, had recently been made a celebrity overnight by the success of his first novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms. He had been on the critics' radar for years after the publication of his magnificent short story, Miriam, in 1945. Trained in ballet, Dunphy had just toured with the Balanchine Company in South America before marrying a fellow dancer from Philadelphia, then treading the boards with his newlywed in the original Broadway production of Oklahoma in 1943. Truman was 11 years Dunphy's junior. Dunphy was born in Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1914 and raised in a working-class neighborhood of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He trained in ballet under Catherine Littlefield, danced at the 1939 New York World's Fair, and toured with the George Balanchine Company in South America in 1941. He married Joan McCracken, another Philadelphia dancer, in 1939. He was 25 and she was 23. They later appeared in the original Broadway production of Oklahoma in 1943, in which McCracken played Sylvie, and Dunphy danced as one of the cowboys. Dunphy also danced in The Prodigal Son, a ballet performed on Broadway in conjunction with the Pirates of Penzance in 1942. Joan McCracken was born in 1917. She was an American dancer and an actress who became famous for her role as Sylvie, or the girl who falls down, in the original 1943 production of Oklahoma. She also was noted for her performances in the Broadway shows Bloomer Girl of 1944, Billion Dollar Baby of 1945, and Dance Me a Song in 1950, and the films Hollywood Canteen of 1945 and Good News of 1947. McCracken, Dunphy's wife, was a trendsetter in musical comedy dance. In her Oklahoma role, she became an instant sensation for a carefully choreographed pratfall during the Many a New Day dance number. She was considered an innovator in combining dance with comedy, and branched into dramatic roles on Broadway and early television. However, her career was cut short, ending several years before her death at age 43, as she suffered complications from diabetes. McCracken was generous in promoting the careers of other dancers, including Shirley MacLaine, and was a strong influence on her second husband, Bob Fosse, whom she married in 1952, encouraging him to become a choreographer, which he did and subsequently left her. She was noted for unconventional behavior and was one of a number of real-life counterparts to inspire the character of Holly Golightly in her friend Truman Capote's novella Breakfast at Tiffany's. McCracken was noted for her eccentric behavior. She was uninhibited and at times seemed to enjoy behaving outrageously. In one meeting with MGM vocal coach Kay Thompson, she removed her blouse and bra to become more comfortable. Dunphy enlisted in the United States Army in January 1944 during World War II. During his service, he published his first work, The Life of a Carrot, in Short Story magazine. McCracken had an affair with French composer Rudy Revel, which spurred their 1948 divorce. However, they remained friends. McCracken spent many of her final years at a beach house in what was then an isolated section of the Pines on Fire Island, New York, and died in 1961. Fire Island has since become a huge magnet for the American gay community. Her ashes were lost. Fights over ashes would reoccur after her ex-husband's death. Back in 1948, Jack Dunphy was divorced and had ditched the performing arts to become, like Truman, an author. His novel in 4 parts, John Fury, exploring the lives of the impoverished Irish in Philadelphia, had been called remarkable, warm, and strong by a prominent New York Times critic. The attraction to his future lover for Dunphy was instantaneous. Truman arrived wearing a little cap and showing off, he later said. I thought he was adorable. But what really underpinned the mysterious one-size-fits-one compatibility between the two men who began a 35-year relationship at the party that evening? The answer may lie on the pages of the further novels Dunphy would go on to write, which dealt lucidly and sensitively with human despair and loneliness. Cafe Moon, for example, is a one-act fantasy for 7 men and 2 women about an aging and disillusioned clerk who drinks his nights away. Too Close for Comfort of 1960 by Dunphy is a full-length comedy drama for 3 men and 1 woman about a suicide-prone young man. The tale of lost young men in New York City is told brilliantly by Truman's 1940 stories, written before he met Dunphy. Shut a Final Door of 1947, for example. Truman was an existential quagmire who would, one might speculate, have engaged Dunphy's interest in the darker avenues of the human condition. A troubled but precociously brilliant but lonely child by many accounts, who taught himself how to read and write, Truman had lived mostly in Alabama with cousins and aunts in his formative years. His parents lived in New York, causing a separation anxiety that he later said felt like being a spiritual orphan, like a turtle on its back. Harper Lee, who became the girl next door turned childhood friend during this period, later based the character Dill in To Kill a Mockingbird on Capote, and one particular sentence, "We came to know him as a pocket Merlin, whose head teemed with eccentric plans, strange longings, and quaint fancies," speaks volumes about Lee's own perceptions of the complex man who would become her close companion, and even enlisting her as a researcher. When Capote was working on the reporting for the book that would become In Cold Blood, his nonfiction novel, as he liked to call it, in 1959, Lee joined him in Holcomb, Kansas, and helped him take notes and interviews. Loneliness, abandonment, and an acute sense of displacement from his early childhood where his parents got divorced prompt in Truman the need to project a flamboyant personality, an endeavor usually underpinned with copious alcohol. He had a mile-wide obsessive streak. His nonfiction novel, In Cold Blood, consumed more than 6 years of his life, and by the time he trashed his own lofty social existence, this is a man who in 1966 held a masked ball at the New York's Plaza Hotel for some 500 of his very closest friends, including his swans, Slim Keith, Gloria Vanderbilt, and Babe Paley, by skewering his famous friends in an excerpt of his unfinished novel published in Esquire. He'd begun a slide which ended via alcoholic bloat with his death, from what the coroner described as liver disease complicated by phlebitis and multiple drug intoxication. Long a heavy drinker and cigarette smoker, by the early 1970s, Capote was abusing cocaine, alcohol, tranquilizers, marijuana, and other substances. Over that decade, he underwent numerous stays at rehabilitation clinics, but each time he was released, he went farther into the abyss, whether it was dancing all night at Studio 54 or embarking upon disastrous personal relationships with lovers and friends away from Dunphy. Dunphy, it appears, could not save him. His quirks, qualms, and peculiarities, all resurrected with chilling persuasiveness, languid, high-pitched voice, and all by Philip Seymour Hoffman in the 2005 biopic, would, it's fair to surmise, have seduced Dunphy coming out of his divorce. In this year's FX series Feud, Capote vs. the Swans, Dunphy is portrayed by Joe Mantello. Capote boasted of a razor-sharp memory for everything he heard during an interview, preferring not to write in front of a subject and instead focus entirely on them. In this pursuit, he long planned to become the Proust of the American social elite, the writer who recorded remarkable encounters with the rich and famous, as well as their foibles and adventurers. He wanted to be the recorder of the age. He told his biographer, Gerald Clark, in 1972 that the novel he was planning would have every sort of person I've ever had any dealings with. I have a cast of thousands. It's no wonder that Capote felt hunted and was pursued by many due to what he would publish. This would be his downfall, as his swans of New York society could not bear to look at themselves in Capote's mirror. They would drop him one by one. As Capote and Dunphy drifted apart, living in separate households in the 1970s after 3 decades together, Capote found himself abandoned yet again. Looking at photographs, there is something very tragic about Capote's little boy face. Capote's feelings for Dunphy. During their halcyon period as a couple, at their Manhattan apartment together, or during jaunts to the Swiss Alps or Portofino, they would often write together and always read each other's manuscripts. After reading Dunphy's fifth novel, First Wine, a tearful Capote apparently asserted simply, "Jack, you're a great artist." First Wine dives into a character's childhood, and critics have argued Dunphy only wrote in response to Capote. First Wine was supposedly Dunphy's response to Capote's Other Voices, Other Rooms. But this stance ignores Dunphy's independent rise as an artist, and so is incorrect. After all, when Dunphy met Capote in 1948, he had already written John Fury, a well-received novel, and was just getting over a painful divorce from McCracken. In 1950, the two writers settled in Taormina, Sicily, in a house where the author D.H. Lawrence had once lived called Villa Britannia. Taormina, once described by the Anglo-Italian aesthete Harold Acton as a polite synonym for Sodom, had been a playground for the rich and artistically inclined long before Capote's arrival, chiefly thanks to the attractive paintings of the German Otto Gallang. Capote was equally taken with the mighty altitude of the views from the villa's railings, but his letters written from the town in the early 1950s and subsequent article entitled Fontana Vecchia are more liberally peppered with his characteristically sharp observations of the people he encountered and had heard about. Nobody escaped Capote's wit, from goat herders and delivery boys to the giants of literature and fashion such as André Gide and Christian Dior. The future author of Breakfast at Tiffany's led a life of early morning writing and early evening strolling, happy to fit in with the people of the Mediterranean. These expeditions to saunter among the crowds while buying supplies were often accompanied by a martini or two and a chance to indulge in some more literary gossip. Capote called orange juice and vodka his orange drink. He was pretty upfront about who he was. "I'm an alcoholic," he would say. "I'm a drug addict. I'm a homosexual. I'm a genius." Although Truman's account of his time in Sicily contains the occasional reference to the supernatural beliefs of the locals, it doesn't indicate that he personally felt any kind of mystical presence in Villa Britannia. His supernatural beliefs lay in the pecan groves of the American South, where he grew up. The same cannot be said for Howard Agg, whose book A Cypress in Sicily relates the curious tale of a bearded apparition in Capote's house. Dunphy was in many ways Capote's opposite, as solitary as Capote was social. Though they drifted more and more apart in the later years, they stayed together officially until Capote's death. When Capote died in 1984, his will named Dunphy as the chief beneficiary. Dunphy kept Capote's ashes in a hollowed-out book in their library. 8 years later, in 1992, Dunphy died of cancer in New York at the age of 77. Dunphy and Capote had separate houses in Sagaponack, New York. Following their deaths, some of the money from their estates was donated to the Nature Conservancy, which used it to acquire nearby Crooked Pond on the Long Island Greenbelt between Sag Harbor, New York, and Bridgehampton, New York. Their mingled ashes were scattered by the pond, where a marker on a stone commemorates them. Joanne Carson, the second wife of Johnny Carson, has maintained that she also has some of Capote's ashes, a claim Dunphy denied, which she had kept at her home in Bel Air in the house where Capote died. Could these be the mysterious missing ashes of McCracken? After the ashes in California were stolen and returned, she bought a crypt for Capote's supposed ashes at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Brentwood, California. although it is unclear if the ashes ever were deposited there. Capote had a good relationship with the Dunphy family and dedicated his short story One Christmas to Jack's sister Gloria Dunphy. Dunphy would always be overshadowed by his lover artistically. Most of Truman's short stories and novellas, such as Miriam, Breakfast at Tiffany's, The Muses Are Heard, The Grass Harp, Local Color, The Dog's Bark, and Music for Chameleons, were vast commercial successes, and for good reason. His storytelling and his imagery is incredibly powerful. But neither disparity in the height of the two men's stars nor lengthy periods apart. We were always repeating the pattern that had commenced in childhood, when one's need to escape from one's own kind was so savage, so burning in its intensity, that had either of us stayed home, we certainly would have perished, Dunphy later said, ever tarnished their relationship. A portion of Capote's ashes were mixed in with Dunphy's when they were scattered on Long Island in 1992, a fitting tribute, perhaps, to the fact that it's not just absence as the two spent, but turbulence too, that makes the heart grow stronger.